Tardes. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for attending today to the 6th CENIEH Distinguished Annual Lecture. As you know, this is an initiative that we started celebrating 6 years ago, and with the aim of giving the opportunity to the broad public, not only to the scientists, but to the society in general, to have the chance to listen firsthand to some of the most renowned scientists in their disciplines. And this is what's going to be happening today. We are very honored to have here with us to give our distinguished lecture this year to Professor Nicholas Conard. Many of you here know well who is he, but he's perfect for this type of celebration because he's going to be talking about something that everybody, scientist or not, has wondered and has an intuition that really makes us human, which is our relationship with music, with art, with religion. So I think this is the best example of a field or a topic that is really coming from human evolutionary studies, but that is of interest for the whole humankind. So I think it's very important to really enhance how our research is indeed of general interest for the society. So this is great to have you here. Professor Nicholas Conard is a Paleolithic archaeologist. He has an outstanding publication record based in long story, like excavating many field projects in Europe, South Africa, Syria, Iran, all over the world. And he's the founding director of the Institute of Archaeological Science in Tübingen University, and currently, if I am right, you are the director of the Department of Early Prehistory and Quaternario Ecology, also Tübingen University. And yes, he's really known as the top expert in the world to this type of things related to what we all feel that make us human. So it is an honor, it's a privilege, and please, you're very welcome. I'm very happy that you accepted our invitation.
Well, one thing about giving up my computer, I see I have nothing in front of me, so I might have to look like this sometime. I apologize. First of all, Maria, thank you so much for the invitation. Well, it's a great honor and a great privilege for reasons I'll mention in a minute. And, I don't always say yes because I have a lot of things to do and, it's not a good idea to be overextended. But when colleagues from this team, from Atapuerca, ask, it's always a very great pleasure. And also for me, extremely valuable to come here. And there are a number of reasons for that. Well, first of all, personal reasons, that there are many people I like and many people I respect who work in the team here. And I guess my connections to Atapuerca go back to when I was a student, when I had the good fortune to have a lot of contact with Emiliana Aguirre. In the 1980s, it was a big deal, right? I mean, I don't see Eodald, but other people will know there's a lot of debate about how long Europe had been settled, right? Short chronologies, long chronologies, all of those things were very debated. A lot of things that students take for granted as a given were really unknown and hotly debated, and Atapuerca played such a key role in so many debates. I will not even go into it. If I start, I will not get to my talk, and my talk is probably too long anyway. But that's one thing. First, the scientific excellence that I associate with the Atapuerca team, and I think many, many other people do, but also the personal connections, Jose Maria, Juan Luis, Eodald, who's not here. And I'm very happy that Eodald was not here because otherwise we would never have gotten out of lunch, because whenever I've been with Eodald for lunch, we never get much further than that. But always the personal hospitality is maybe the most important thing, and the personal respect, but also the scientific achievement. And when you're a scientist, you need also to have role models, right? And I travel around a lot. It's hard to find good role models. And the best role model in the world for me is Atapuerca, right? The team, all you've been able to achieve. And just like in so many parts of life, if you have nothing you can look up to as something you might want to achieve, it's a little hard I have many visions, but it's great to have something at such a high level that a vision seems possible, right? If you can make this building and the buildings next door and World Heritage and the excavations and 200 people on the excavations doing great work, it seems to me pretty much anything is possible. And so for me, that's very meaningful. And when I say this is the best team in the world, I really mean that. And anyone who knows me knows that I've been saying this for a very, very long time. So you have my greatest respect. My only regret is it looks like your Minister of Science is not here. So will she be here tomorrow? Because I wanted to tell her this. But you can tell her the propaganda message I would say whether she was here or not. But in any case, but having the Ministry of Science for the whole country of Spain coming here also tells you something. I guess when I think of what I've achieved, it's so little compared to what you've achieved. The only thing that makes me feel a little better about that is in Germany, it's only the states that have power in science and heritage issues. So we never have the possibility of having federal funding. We may be for a research project, but not for an institute. So that helps me feel a little better about our modest achievements in Swabia. But what I wanted to do, and then another thing is, I was talking to, I think, Marina about this and maybe others, is that a lot of young scientists and older scientists too are always in a hurry, right? If you embrace the process and do good work, it's not about being in a hurry, it's about doing good work and embracing the process properly, right? And if you embrace the process, everything's going to fall into place, right? And I can see some people in the room have come to Tübingen and spent some time with us, and I know sometimes the younger colleagues were saying, oh, this is terrible, I'll never find a job, it's going to be so difficult. I said, no, everything's cool, everything's going to fall into place. Just embrace the process, enjoy your work, and everything will fall into place. And I see in many places people in a big hurry, trying to rush out publications, trying to increase this factor or that factor. And my advice to young people or old people would be just embrace the process. If you do a good job and enjoy what you're doing, everything's going to be fine. And in a way, it would be very sad if a field like ours, which is based on so much trust, personal interactions, if that were reduced to a normal field where it's just like a conveyor belt of science. I hope if that ever comes to Paleolithic archaeology, human evolution, well, I hope I'm already part of the fossil record when that happens. But okay, let's get started. I'm a little concerned my talk might be perhaps too long. so let's get started. And Clara gave me the clicker. Again, I don't have a screen here, so I might have to stand here so I can see what I'm projecting. Okay, so I wanted to talk about the evolution of art and music, and really in broad terms, and I was told to keep it at a generally understandable level. I'll try to define most of the terms I use. And Carla, you gave me a water, and I drank it all, and I forgot to get another one. I think I might need another one later. Here are some of the questions I want to address. Juan Luis, we were talking about this today. Are things monocentric or polycentric in evolution? Something that only happens once, or something that happens over and over again? That's something to consider. I want to also look at what allowed modern humans to outcompete Neanderthals and other archaics. I want to look at what role, if any, did art and music play in the success of modern humans, biological success. As we know today, there's only one hominid on the planet Earth. Most of human history was very different. And then I want to look at the Swabian caves of southwestern Germany to look at this question because I think, as we'll see, we have a very unique record. I could certainly have had this slide only drawing on Atapuerca, but let's just stay in Germany, right? We have Homo heidelbergensis, some sort of chronospecies leading into Neanderthals, and then modern humans, all indications are come from the outside, right? And if we think about how late Homo heidelbergensis or early Neanderthals lived, really we just need to go to Schöningen, a place I've been digging since 2008, I've been responsible for the excavations, and I will not go into all the details, but I think everyone in the room knows about the spears and the butchered animals and so many things we have from Schöningen that really give us a baseline for how people lived and show us that even late Homo heidelbergensis almost certainly had some way of communicating about the past, the present, the current situation, organizing their technology, planning on how to implement group activities. All of these things clearly were present in the middle of the Middle Pleistocene. And I somehow think of, John Shea was once quoted as saying, the easiest way to be wrong in paleoanthropology is to underestimate our ancestors. I know, Juan Luis, you're maybe one of a few people who might overestimate them. I'm just kidding, I'm kidding. But in general, we see such a small piece of the evidence that, of course we shouldn't make up fairy tales, but if we're just looking at rocks and bones, there's a lot more going on than just that. And so I also admire your work and other people's work who are trying to push the limits a little bit. And as long as we distinguish between what we can prove and what we speculate upon or hypothesize on, that's fine, right? No problem. Antonio, I remember when you came to Tübingen winning our research prize, that was an issue, right? How far back do we have systematic hunting? All these questions are things we're gradually figuring out. And those of us in the field who have been in the field for a long time see how ideas change, right? Noemi had to, convince me that we had Magdalenian cannibalism, and I've learned a lot from your team. So, in any case, okay. And then we have these strange things. You can imagine there are 100 examples of scratched objects or weird things. My personal opinion on this is it's probably just chance. But let's just say, going back fairly far in time, you can find a series of scratches and lines and different markings on things. Some people view these as some kind of proto-symbols of some kind. I tend to be a little skeptical, but I just want to mention there are many examples of these kinds of objects. I think a more interesting kind of data come from the burials. I personally think that burials are often deliberate, right? I mean, Neanderthals, come on, if the Cima de los Huesos people are being brought in and thrown into a hole, which seems likely, the Neanderthal burials to me seem believable, sometimes with ochre. So if we accept them as deliberate burials, we can ask ourselves why. And this doesn't mean that every Neanderthal was buried or every Neanderthal had ochre or anything like this, but some of the examples of burials, these are just examples from the Near East, they're examples in Europe, probably are legitimate examples of Neanderthals burying their dead, probably connected in some way or form with some kind of belief in what happens after you die, or a connection between our world and some kind of nether world after death. To me, that doesn't seem like too radical a point of view. I wouldn't call it religion in a strict sense, but there's probably something going on there. Okay, the Neanderthal painting, in Spain, let's just say, the people I know working in the project say the dates are actually from examples of pigment on a wall, not any of the more systematic depictions, although the illustrations often show the systematic depictions. It is not the least bit surprising that Neanderthals could put pigments on the wall because they're putting pigments in many other places. As far as I can tell, having talked to some of the excavators and people working on the project, there's no evidence for anything figurative or even abstract that's been dated yet. But certainly I have no problem with pigments on the walls by Neanderthals. I don't view that as a problem at all. If we think about modern humans, we can go back 300,000 years ago, and we can see lithic artifacts. Also super interesting. I don't know if you can see, but the lithic artifacts that we find from the Middle Stone Age are often pretty much like what we know from the Middle Paleolithic, not very much different from what we know from Neanderthals in many cases. So the technology is very similar. I'm also someone who would argue that one thing that irritates me is so often people ask me, well, what was life like for Neanderthal? That's like asking, what is life like for a modern human? Depends. Who are you? Where are you? What are you doing? What's happening? And there is no answer to that question because I've dug enough Neanderthal sites to know the technology varies a lot, everything varies a lot, the regions vary a lot. So I think that's not a very good question. But let's just say, in general terms, there's a lot of technological overlap between how Neanderthals are solving their problems and how modern people are solving their problems. Of course, Herto, another example later on, but let's say, in this 300,000 years on, we certainly have modern humans in Africa. I think most people are pretty convinced by the out of Africa ideas. We spent a lot of time working in southern Africa. I'm not going to talk about this much, but for instance, at Zebudu, I've spent the last 14 years excavating. Zebudu, by the way, is going to be almost certainly voted a World Heritage Site in August, this month, at the end of this month in New Delhi, along with Deep Kloof and Pinnacle Point. And I was talking, I don't remember whom I was talking today, but also in Atapuerca, a lot of support came in connection with World Heritage status, and I think that will be the case with the MSA sites. But amazing MSA sites, beautiful stratigraphy, and I think the most spectacular examples of abstract depictions are the engraved ostrich eggshells from Deep Kloof. They're also known from Klipdrift and other sites. So I'm not saying that symbolism comes from the Swabian Jura. There are a lot of other things going on, but the record of early abstract depictions looks like this. This is probably the most impressive form. This is from Pierre-Jean Texier's work at Deep Kloof. And you can see the most common form are the railroad track motifs. They're cross-hatching. There are lots of different variations. We don't really know what was being communicated here, but something was definitely being communicated here. The people who saw these eggs knew what this meant. John Parkman would say that meant, oh, this is Maria's egg, don't touch it, or this is Jose Maria's egg, feel free, or whatever it happened to be. But some kind of information was stored here because the patterns repeat themselves over and over again. It's not chance, it means something, it's some kind of information storage and communication, but it's clearly abstract. Also here, I'm not going to talk about the details of the spread across the globe, but then we need to think about if we have modern humans in Africa starting around 300,000 years ago, how do modern humans go across the whole world, and how do we come to a point like today where the only people in the whole world are modern humans, when all of human history before was characterized by having sometimes quite a few different species coexisting, sometimes even in neighboring regions. So we had at least 50,000 years ago 4 groups of hominins: Neanderthals, Denisovans, Flores hominids, and Homo sapiens, and many people would have even more, right? So there's no question that we have to explain how we came to a situation where all living people today are like us, right? So that is a really fundamental question and the complete outlier when we think of human evolution. The picture's gotten more complicated, right? It's been clear for a while that there's not just one movement out of Africa. And I think, Maria, we were also talking about lunch, about different dating in different regions. Well, we're not going to go into all the details, but there is evidence that the situation's more complicated. It's not just one exit from Africa and then a sudden spread across the globe. And what I always like to think is, well, I'll touch upon this in a minute, but if modern humans were so, let's just simplify and use the term superior or more successful biologically than archaics, it doesn't take very long to walk from East Africa to the rest of the world. Why would it take 250,000 years, right? That observation in and of itself tells you that the playing field was very balanced for a very long time. We can look at the Skul and Kafsa in Israel have been known for a long time to be old examples of modern humans outside of Africa. And this starts to get interesting because you can look at what do we know about the material culture of these early modern humans in the Near East. And I think people in the room will know that they're found with Mousterian assemblages, typical Middle Paleolithic assemblages that are no different than the Neanderthal assemblages, and not different from the local Neanderthal assemblages or the European ones. So they can't be the lithic technology. What's interesting is they use pigments, they bury their dead with pigments, and like Other hominins across southern and northern Africa, probably in between as well, they often have personal ornaments, and the personal ornaments are always perforated natural forms, shells, right? Some people work in these areas on some of the key sites in the room, so that's not new. And when the people got to Skolenkassa, again, wouldn't be hard just to walk to certainly where I work and spread across the world, but that did not happen. So that in and of itself is pretty interesting. And one can debate about how one defines modernity, modern people. You know, do we do it based on anatomy? Do we do it based on material culture? One way of doing it is defining it, well, it's only one way, but modern humans, you could say, are modern when they replace the archaics. And if that's the case, we're still here on very even footing because it's back and forth, back and forth. And this is why it was so strange, you know, when the geneticists kept saying, oh, there's no interbreeding between archaics and moderns. If you're living side by side with an organism that does almost the exact same thing you do, that's very similar, why wouldn't there be interbreeding, right? The one thing that has to happen is people have to reproduce. And I don't know, we can discuss that later if anyone's interested. But let's just say these are very sophisticated people. Their contemporary Neanderthals are too, but these people did not spread across the world and drive modern humans to extinction, archaics to extinction. We could think, can't show everything, but I've done a lot of work in Syria and the Zagros, and here at a site like Garibuf, at the exact same time I'll be talking about later, 41,000 years ago, we do have personal ornaments, perforated teeth, perforated shells, but never figurative art, never music. And these sites, all of the sites, whether it's in Africa or in Iran, Syria, we always use the same techniques. Or if anything, we use even more careful techniques here because we float everything because of the botanical remains. So if there were musical instruments or figurative art, we would find them, and we don't, which I would say is a pretty strong indication that if they existed at all, they were extremely rare. Then we've got other examples of early modern humans, and again, not surprisingly. And then we get a little closer to Europe with the work at Bacciocchiro, and there we can see about 45,000 years ago modern humans. Interestingly, with ornaments, no sign of figurative art or anything like that. We have something similar. Slatikun doesn't have artifacts with it. It's isolated faunal material, but at the site published Ranis just a couple months ago, the leaf point assemblages seem now, from at least Ranis, to be associated with modern humans. And our genetic friends, I just literally a week ago heard a talk from Johannes Krause where he was stressing, as others have, that these early modern humans did not contribute to the current gene pool. So they died out. Interesting. And so I'll fast forward a little bit. Well, I asked Johannes the question, well, you know, we archaeologists have been saying for about 100 years that the Aurignacian people who had all these things are probably the ones who made it. But I don't see Antonio. But but the geneticists, unless they define it themselves based on genetic studies, they won't believe us. Not only do they won't believe us, they won't even care. But I don't know who's watching. But I should always be careful if we're being filmed or broadcast around the world. But no, but it's interesting. From our point of view, people have argued for years that art and certain things that are lacking in the cultural groups I've talked about and appear around 40,000 years ago, those people with all of these cultural innovations are probably the ones that made it. We will see how the genetics plays out down the road. Okay, and that brings us to our main story. And I guess I wasn't going to talk about football. I was thinking about talking about football, but this is where Spain just beat Germany in Stuttgart, and I was going to actually talk about that. I shouldn't do this, but I will anyway. But you know, it's like the Spanish team, right? If I played football in the Spanish team, I would think about those great teams, 2008, 2010, 2012, that won everything, right? And I'd have a role model. And you guys, if I were the 16-year-old playing for Spain, I would look at those people who won everything, and that's what I'm like when I look at the Atapuerca team. You guys are the champions, and it motivates me to try to do a good job too. And we'll see how the football pans out. But they were playing in Stuttgart, which was right here. And so we're just a little east of Stuttgart, and if you zoom, and another important thing is that the Danube flows into the Black Sea, and if you come up the Danube, you get here, and there are two key valleys. Why didn't you guys send me excavations? I don't see many people who've come to dig with us, but if you want to come, you can. It's not a problem. And I was talking to Marina to try to send you some more people, because I think, we need to always keep the exchanges going. But the key regions in Germany and in Swabia are the Lone Valley. In German, you always pronounce the last valley, Lone, and then the Ach Valley. And I'll talk about, there are many more sites, but I'll only talk about 4 sites. And these are the 4 sites that have produced figurative art and the musical instruments. In the Lone Valley, Vogelherd and Bockstein. And in the Ach Valley, Geisenklöstel and Hohlefels. And Christophe, I knew we were doing a really good job when the French colleagues started saying Geisenklöstel, and they could actually say it and pronounce it more or less correctly. Then I knew we were really doing well, because you have so many sites that are so difficult to pronounce. So now I feel like we're really a member of the community, right? So it's a process, what gets sort of into the canon of names one needs to know. But those are the sites I'll be talking about, and the source of the Danube is just over here in a place called Donaueschingen. So if you imagine coming up the Danube, this is where the Danube ends, and we have the good fortune of having a lot of caves with very good preservation. I was talking to someone today about Quellenkritik. We always try to show respect to those who came before us, who did the great work. That's why I mentioned Emiliano, and I want to stress the work at the end of the 19th century at Atapuerca, right? And so I would feel it would be dishonest if I don't mention people like Oscar Frass, who was like Lartet in France, coming from paleontology, or R.R. Schmidt, who founded our institute. Gustav Rieck, I'll talk about a little more, or Joachim Hahn. There are a lot of people who contributed to the work I'll talk about. I've, though, spent the last 29 years digging. I had the good fortune to be hired as the head of early prehistory and quaternary ecology in 1995, and every year I go into the field, and it's funny, and my admiration for the Atapuerca team is, 29 years, that's not long compared to what you guys have been doing here and at Abric Romani and other places, but this is what it takes to do good work. And I understand that not everyone has the resources to do the good work, but cutting corners is not going to lead to success in science, and you have to embrace the process. If you don't embrace the process, you're not going to be doing cutting-edge research. And another thing about research is always respect the people who are producing the information we use. And I feel that, here and in many other areas, Atapuerca is really a role model. Okay, but I've worked at all these sites. And this brings us to the question, what is different about our Aurignacian deposits? In our region, the earliest Upper Paleolithic is the Aurignacian. And there are many, many technological innovations that are different. And I'm not going to talk about, I might talk about Bâton Percé in a second, but in general, I'm not talking about technological innovations today because of time, but we have 4 symbolic areas of innovations. We have ornaments with a 3-dimensional form, not perforated objects like teeth or shells, but shaped ornaments. Another thing we have are figurative art. Figurative art, you see a picture of a mammoth or a horse, any child would look at it and say, oh, that's a horse, cabal, or it's completely clear. You can debate the context and the meaning, but no one would question, that's a mammoth, that's a horse, that's a lion. Then we have mythical imagery or terianthropic imagery. we have multiple depictions that are half human, half animal, which is also super interesting because it means that the people living at this time were not just depicting what they saw in the landscape. They had a different level of understanding that was more abstract about a world other than our real world around us, but a world of beliefs and ideas. And I think it's pretty obvious if you think about it. In our world, our explanations tend to be scientific, right? Today's Sunday? It's Sunday. So how many of you went to church this morning? Probably not so many. But if you're living in a world where you don't know why the sun goes up in the morning and why the moon has cycles and why winter comes and why someone dies or lives, these are all things that you can only explain with your system of beliefs or how you engage with it. So it's not surprising that people at this time, and maybe a bit earlier, had religious ideas. And this is, I'll talk about this a bit, the mythical imagery is really important because it's not just like taking photographs of mammoths or lions on the landscape. There's also a different level. And then the last thing I'll talk about are the musical instruments. And to get to the point a little bit ahead of time, I'm not telling a mystery, I'm just going through the information. But at the same time, these other three things come about. Musical instruments come about. And you can be sure if there are multiple kinds of flutes, I'll show you at least 3 different kinds of flutes, and there are other kinds as well. People are clapping their hands. If they're playing music, they're singing, they're doing, there's a lot going on here. But maybe I'll touch upon this a little bit more later. But these are 4 classes of symbolic artifacts that don't exist in an earlier time. So what I think when they get the DNA sequencing figured out, they will figure out that these are the people who contributed to the current gene pool. And when they do that, say, well, yeah, this is what the archaeologists have been saying for 100 years, So, and why? Because every society of living people all have music, all have ornaments, all have art, all have myth and stories and systems of beliefs. So it must come from somewhere, right? Okay, now I'm just going to talk about these 4 sites, and I'll do it fairly quickly. The first discovery was in 1931 by Gustav Rieck. This is Gustav Rieck. The excavation, the key layers are, I can see it a little better here, are units 4 and 5. That's the ordination, and the ordination material represents about 95% of everything from Vogelherd. And these are just some of the 12 figurines they found. And so in 1931, and this was published in 1942, there was a major monograph in 1943. So before World War II, even before the Nazis were in power, this was known to the community. And it's interesting, what did people say about this? Because the finds were found with ordination artifacts, with split base bone points, perforated batons, all kinds of carinated scrapers and many other tools that were by definition ordination. And Laurent Grand wrote in the 70s, this is the translation, all known works of art from the earliest phase belong to the primitive period. This artistic expression is still very clumsy. And he always argued that things like the vulva depictions from La Ferracie and other sites in the Dordogne, or very abstract animal depictions, not abstract, but simple animal depictions, were the beginnings of art. And why? Because it had to develop gradually. That was the idea. And my professor, Bozinski, he's still alive, although he's not doing well, he wrote, the animal representations from Vogelherd are perfect. It is inconceivable that they belong to the beginnings of artistic expression. Inconceivable. It's not even possible. Why? Because they're perfect. And he thought, he didn't point so much to the finds from the Dordogne, but to Zungir or something like that. And this is sort of relevant. I don't know how many French people, I'm feeling a little sorry for the French people, they might lose the football match, but Christophe, it's the 30th anniversary of Grotte-Chauvet's discovery. What happened when Grotte-Chauvet was discovered? No one believed it. Why? Because it was too perfect. It's too beautiful. It's too perfect. It's the same reason no one believed that the Vogelherd figurines were old 100 years ago. It's interesting, right? And Juan Luis, we were talking about this today, about how preconceptions dominate our views of the past and science, right? So it's interesting. So what I'm saying today, I think went through the stages of disbelief, skepticism, and gradual acceptance that we've seen in other contexts. Okay, in any case, the reason I started re-excavating Vogelherd, it took me a while to get around to it, but some of you know the original Neanderthal site where the 1856 fossils were found. There was a re-excavation. The guys I showed in that picture were the ones who did it, and they found more material. And no one even knew where the debris was at Neanderthal, because the stuff had, the whole valley had been destroyed. Here, it was completely obvious. The finds were just outside the cave where they dumped the material. I thought, well, might as well go dig and see what happens. What I didn't know is that it would take me 10 years to dig and 20 years of sorting and washing to do it. I thought maybe it'll take 2 or 3 years. This was probably, I don't know if it was the worst job I ever had, but it really took a very, very long, it took forever. I know probably Adrian and Noemi and Antonio, when you were in Tübingen, I'm sure you saw people sorting and sorting. It was a huge job. But also interesting, the only excavation beforehand had been here. I have to be careful what I say. That's why I don't like recorded or broadcast talks. But Eberhard Wagner dug here in these black dotted lines and here, if you can see that, in 1977 and published that there was nothing. They found nothing. One can only draw the conclusion that they were blind, or maybe if you're more generous, they wanted to say there was nothing there so no one would go dig there. But choose whatever you want. They published that there was nothing there. And we started digging, and thousands and thousands and thousands of finds. And 35,000 water screening samples. And I won't bore you with all the details, but it was a lot of work. Screening at a very large scale that only someone from Atapuerca could understand. And in any case, lots of screening, lots of sorting, lots of data entry, and so about 99% of the deposit we re-excavated. After washing everything, there were still 82 tons of material that had to be hand sorted. More than, these numbers are actually a bit low, but more than 225,000 lithic artifacts. 1,700 organic artifacts, ivory, bone, tools, ivory, antler and bone tools, 37 new split-base bone points, more than 600 personal ornaments, at least 64 definite artworks and fragments of artworks, 107 probable pieces, 14 definite flute fragments, and let's just say lots and lots of material. And it was fun. Some of the pieces, we could fit the head of this bear from my excavation onto the original piece, or here the same piece. This for nearly 100 years was considered a relief, and we found at least part of the backside of it, right, that this piece fits on the back of the head of the lion. I don't have time to go into all the details about the markings and the artistic aspects of it, but let's just say if you come to Tübingen and look at the pieces, they really are, not all of them, but a lot of them are perfect and beautiful. Let's just say in the same way, if you go to Chauvet, it's breathtaking. If you go to our sites and look at the pieces, quite a few of them are really spectacular. Fishes, all sorts of things. This is called the hedgehog. There weren't hedgehogs in this climatic period, but it's probably a hare. It's not always easy to tell what these pieces are, but this is like the refitting super easy. When you have something like this, and then you find the backside of it, it's very clear. And the one here, we'd usually find them broken in pieces, but this is a mammoth that came out one day. I told someone I told you I would skip the anecdotes. I have so many anecdotes about every one of these discoveries, but we will be here till midnight. If I start telling stories, I will refrain. But I have very good stories about all of these things. But in any case, this is what they look like when you find them in the ground, and then you wash them up and they look more like this. really spectacular pieces. And I guess what I would say is just very simply put, there's no difference between, in my mind at least, Michelangelo and the people who are making these carvings, or Rembrandt and the people painting Chauvet, right? There's nothing primitive about the art at all. And Laurent and Pozinski were right that the work is perfect. But that doesn't mean it's young, right? And so it seems that the earliest figurative art in the world is perfect, which is kind of interesting, something to think about. Okay, then flutes. This is, again, the chronology is not quite right, because then I'd have to jump between the sites. I'm just going site by site. But these are some examples of the flute fragments from Vogelherd. They're all from my excavation. He went fast. He dug everything in 2 months, so it's not surprising that most of the finds were in the back dirt. But here I think you can see clearly, if you're lucky, you find a piece like this. You can see the finger holes, and this is a griffin vulture. There's still griffin vultures in Spain. And the interesting thing is the holes, this plays a role later, the holes are always scraped out. They're never drilled. They're sort of scraped and beveled, always. It's important because when you see a surface like this, it's pretty much always a flute. And like everything in science, until you find one, the hard part is finding the first one. And then once you know what you're looking for, assuming the people who are doing the sorting know what they're looking for, it's not that hard to find the other ones, the next ones. Okay, and then these come from Vogelherd, but the first discoveries were from Geisenkler, so I'll show you in a bit. This is from a swan flute, 3 pieces of a swan flute. The critical piece is especially here with the beveled finger hole. And this, you don't have to believe me, but this is definitely, it's only about 1 centimeter big, and it's from ivory, but it is definitely part of an ivory flute for reasons I'll show in a minute. The reasons it has to be an ivory flute is that there are 4 things about it. First, this edge, perfectly straight. It's on the dentin cementum border, a perfect cut. Every single other kind of mammoth ivory artifact we have is always convex, always. And what do we have here? Concave. And you also see vertical scrapes inside, hollowing it out. Then you see a beveled finger hole. And even more diagnostic, these notches at about a couple millimeters apart, and the notches can go across the seam of the dentum cementum border. This will play a role later. So you don't have to believe me that these are flute fragments, but they are, and I'll show you why later. Okay, the next site, Hollenstein-Stadel, and I could give you a lecture only on the Nazi history of these sites because it's super interesting. But this is kind of the technique. Robert Wetzel was the excavator. He was the head of in Germany say the Nationalsozialistischen Dozentenbund, the head of the professors in the party. And he was very jealous of Rieck for finding all these artworks, and he went to start digging nearby in the Lone Valley. You can see the excavation technique is not so different than Rieck's. And among other things, in this audience, some of you will know there was a femur found there that Cosmo Post studied as part of his PhD that showed that it was a very genetically basal Neanderthal. And most importantly, I'd say, is the discovery of the Lion Man. Every single other example of the figurative art from the Swabian Jura they're small pieces. Every one you can hold in the palm of your hand, except this one. This one's over 31 centimeters high, weighs about 3/4 kilo, and all the other finds were found just in debris from daily life, which is also something I was talking about today. It's funny, these topics come up. We weren't talking about artworks or flutes or anything, but we were talking about daily life. But this is not part of daily life. This was found very far back in the cave. Also discovered, I can't ignore all anecdotes, but it was discovered the last day of excavation in late August 1939. The war started I think many will know, on September 1st, 1939. So the last day, they packed everything up, and the boxes were stored, the artifacts were all stored in cigar boxes. And so, and Wetzel noted in his notebook, lots of worked ivory. And it was in he dug in 20 centimeter units, and it was in the 20th meter back in the cave. And that was it. The war started. He lost his job after the war, and nothing happened to the finds. And then he died in the early 60s unexpectedly of a heart attack. And then Joachim Hahn finished his PhD on the ordination, and his first job was to take an inventory of Wetzel's finds, and he did that. And he gets back to the 20th meter, to the 6th unit, from 1 meter to 1 meter 20, opens a box, and there are more than 200 pieces of worked ivory, and he starts putting it together and very quickly realizes that it's a lion man, or at least something like that. It took a while. A couple students helped him, Hartwig Löhr and Gerd Albrecht, and he went to the Heritage Office and said, well, I found a figurine. He wanted to put it together. And they said, no, we're not paying you to put together lion men. You have to take an inventory of the finds. And so he had to do the puzzle work late at night, which led to a whole range of other things that I will tell you over a beer if you're interested. But in any case, this is important, a very unique find, one of the most famous pieces of Paleolithic art, and super important because it shows the fluidity between the perception of the human body, human existence, and the animal world. Maybe not surprising if you think of Paleolithic art, and the prevalence of animal depictions is almost universal. The fourth site is Geisenklöstle, a site that Hahn mainly dug. After Hahn's death, I continued the excavation in the basal ordination and dug most of the Middle Paleolithic. This is in the Ach Valley, between Blaubeuren and Schäklingen. And this is interesting because Geisenklöstle was the first site dug using completely modern excavation techniques. And what is clear here, which had also been argued at numerous other sites, is that there's a stratigraphic gap between the Upper Paleolithic ordination deposits, or not deposits, artifacts, and the artifacts from the Middle Paleolithic. And we see this over and over again, that when modern humans come into the area, we find the ordination, and the ordination seems to be fully developed from the beginning. And they seem to come in, I use the term population vacuum model. I used to study nuclear physics and beamlines. Like the modern humans are sort of being sucked up the Danube up into this area. When they get there, there aren't too many Neanderthals around. I personally always expected that the stratigraphic situation would be more like, well, either like this, the first modern humans are right on top of the last Neanderthals, or maybe like this, that they're coming and going, interacting. But in our region, it's super interesting. It's always separated, always. It's very interesting. And also in science, when you find things you don't expect, those are the things that are probably true, right? Because I thought, why, this is ridiculous. Why would the Neanderthal populations be so low at this time? Because in my PhD, had showed that Neanderthals can live in almost any conditions. But this is certainly something the geneticists are interested in, and it does look like the population density of Neanderthals was pretty low when modern humans came. Hahn found 4 new figurines. There's actually more of it, but this is a mammoth, a bear. It's often been called a bison, but it's almost certainly a muskox. Sam Brown, who's coming here, identified muskox at the site. We know there are muskox around. It's not essential, but it's nice to also have muskox bones at Geisenklöstle. And then this piece, this is another, in my opinion, lion man. You can see it has a very long, straight torso. The legs are... Good thing the flexibility and agility of Homo sapiens, right? There's legs are spread out. There's a tail. I don't know if you can see it in the light, but there's definitely a tail, and then kind of short arms hanging up. In my opinion, it's another lion man. Well, this will play a role later. I can't go into the details, but a lot of markings and different things, a lot of different interpretations. So these, and there's a couple other fragments, but these are very famous. And this is when I was a student. And so when I was a student, there was all this kind of myth, not myth, but excitement, magic about the Swabian artworks. And I don't know, maybe I studied chemistry and physics and geology and things like that. And, I don't get me wrong, I get excited about the art, but it's not magic for us scientists. It's beautiful, it's fun, it's exciting, but, there's this aura. And then I started to find sites, to find more material, and I came to the conclusion, this is the most normal thing in the world. If you dig any of these sites and you know what you're doing and you embrace the process and do it right, you're going to find these. And every single site that I've dug using the correct techniques have produced all of these categories of finds. And Riek didn't find a single ivory bead. We found over 600, right? And the flutes, of course, no one found because no one knew they were there. Many things are like that. So, do the job carefully, keep your eyes open, and you'll be successful. Hahn wrote his habilitation, Kraft und Aggression. There's a lot of discussion about this. What's the meaning? His idea was that this had to do with power and aggression, and one reason is that the most common animals depicted are lions and mammoths. And it's true, they're very common, but you saw, from my excavations, we have fish and hare and all sorts of other things. Birds are coming, yeah. And so that was one thing. And another piece of work that was interesting was David Lewis Williams. I don't know if anyone's read The Mind in the Cave, but it's a very famous book. And this kind of blew me away because I think it came out in 2001 or 2002. This is about the time I was starting to publish this. And David Lewis Williams, who's in Johannesburg, and this is about the time when, let's say, the MSA hype was really getting going. Lewis Williams said, he thought that art developed when modern humans came into the territories of archaics, and basically in the context of a Darwinian competition between archaics and moderns. One of them, it happened to be moderns, developed art and myth, and some of you will know that one of his favorite topics is shamanism, like Jean-Claude, right, and others. And so he argues that the initial religion or system of beliefs is shamanism, and for obvious reasons, you can imagine how much he loves the lion man, right? If your whole life is invested in, not whole life, but one of the main things he's argued for decades is that shamanism is the original kind of universal religion. And so he was very happy about this and argues that this is the beginnings of art, and it happens in the context of competence. He was explicitly using Darwinian models that this is what triggers the success of modern humans. Then musical instruments. The first musical instrument was published in 1995. It was found by Susanna Minzel. Some of you in the room know Susanna. She was just sorting the material and sees these beveled holes. I think this first one is a swan flute made from 27 pieces. And so you have to find the pieces, put them together, and you can only find the pieces if you're actually going to be looking for bird bones and start to think about it. And you can't do this kind of stuff if you're in a hurry, right? And so I would prefer to give a talk only about music, because then I could do it justice. But I just thought I would play one piece of music. The only reason I'm playing this piece is because it's the shortest recording. It's 34 seconds, and it's played by Friedrich Seeberger. It's one of the first recordings ever made on a reconstructed flute of this kind. This one has 3 finger holes, these beveled holes. It's definitely a swan bone, and it's being played in Holofez. And if you listen closely, assuming it works, we'll see if it works, you'll hear the drips of water, right, in the cave, drip, 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 and you'll hear it. And it's not really a special recording. It's just short, but it gives you some idea of how Seeberger chose to play the instrument. But you can also imagine, this is a little more kind of, I'm not an aficionado when it comes to Japanese flute music or anything, but it's more like that, a little more contemplative. But I would also think, and I don't know what others think, but I mean, why wouldn't there be Jimi Hendrix or Janis Joplin or something? Why would music have to be, calm, right? There could be, let's, go crazy music. But in any case, this is very kind of calm music. But he was the first one to ever record anything on these instruments, and they're exact reconstructions. So if we're lucky, Clara will now play this piece. So that gives you at least an impression of the kinds of music you play on this kind of flute. Keep in mind, there are lots of other kinds of flutes, and keep in mind, if you're playing multiple kinds of flutes, there's a lot of other stuff going on. How are you going to play flutes and not clap your hands? How are you going to play flutes and not dance? How are all these things? Nobody is playing a flute in a cultural vacuum. They're playing flutes in a context, whether it's some kind of sacred context or more mundane context. My speculation is once you have music, once you have art, you use it in all contexts, right? It's not limited to one thing. And just like, if you go to a good movie, what makes a good movie? You have different things you can talk about, right? There are different levels of meaning, right? If you go to a movie and there's nothing, it's just like some basic story, nothing interesting happens, there's nothing to talk about, it's not even art. But if anything that's artistic has lots of ways of looking at it, and also music. It's always going to be more complicated, and I wouldn't necessarily go down a completely extreme hermeneutical approach where anything is possible, but let's just say a lot of things are possible. It would be naive to think that art and music is somehow one-dimensional and only means one thing. It means many things. Also back then, in my opinion. Okay, this is the first. This, I don't get surprised very easily. But this surprised me. One day, Maria Malina came to me and said, Nick, I think I found an ivory flute. I said, Maria, who would make a flute out of ivory? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I said, but keep looking, keep looking. And Maria was able to fit 31 fragments of ivory together, every one of them concave. There are no other concave forms. The finger holes, this is just wax so it doesn't fall apart, but the finger holes are all beveled, and there's 1, 2, 3, at least 4. And I don't know if it seems like the projection is not too sharp, but if you see here, this is the dentine cementum border where it's split. So if you only have one half, because it's split open, mammoth ivory has a spiral form. So even if you knew how to drill a hole in it, you can't because it's not straight. And so that's why you have to rough it out. You have to split it open on the dentine cementum border, and then you have to hollow it out. And you can see on the inside all these marks from the stone tools hollowing it out. You make the finger holes, and then you put all these little notches on it. And when you're refitting, it's pretty good when you can get the notches on both sides of the seam. It's definitely a flute. And then probably it was tied together with plant fibers or sinews and then sealed with birch pitch, wax, something along those lines. And then the other thing is, why would you even go to the trouble? And the reason is probably that you can make it any size you want. Whereas with a vulture bone or a swan bone or a goose bone, you can only have the size that it comes in. And here, if you're willing to make the effort and know how to do it, you can make the flute any size you want, and the larger the flute, the lower the tone. And so it's not just one kind of flute, there are lots of different kinds of flutes, and sometimes individual sites, in fact all of them, have multiple kinds of flutes. You can look at where they fall. This is something I've never published, but it is interesting. If I don't think the sample sizes are large enough to prove it, but it is interesting where we have both. I think all of these things are evolving together at the same time. But if you ask the question, which is lower in the stratigraphic column, the flutes or the art? Usually the flutes, which is kind of interesting to think about for the music lovers. So if you wanted to hypothesize musical instruments start and everything else follows, if you wanted to do that, there could be some evidence for that. I personally would argue for caution, but if it's just interesting, it's something I'm keeping an eye on. And then the dates, this is also interesting because some of you, I guess you guys are mostly working on older stuff, but when I published all this stuff in the early 2000s, I was getting so much flack. Christoph will probably know this, from Francesco de Errico and Joao and Zuliao and all these people, were just so, pretty much, they probably published more on my sites about why they're terrible, useless sites than I have on my sites just presenting normal information, because it got somehow caught into this idea about Neanderthal acculturation, et cetera, and I'm not even addressing those questions. My work has some implications for it, and there, as some of you know, maybe White in Toronto and other people in NYU and other people had argued that the symbolism that you find with Neanderthals is the result of acculturation. It came because they copied off the modern humans, and that still is a big debate, but back then it was a very heated debate. And so the colleagues were super upset that these sites were older than, that they were too early. And people used it to support the acculturation model. But the funny thing is, every time we dated it, they were always old. And nobody wanted to believe it. And there was another thing. Some people might know there's a proto-ordination and the ordination. The proto-ordination lacks artworks, and there are almost no personal ornaments or anything. But when you look at, so the age of Geisenkler, so this is, I'm deliberately using Hayam's data, the beginnings in their Bayesian modeling, there are different ways you can do this, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 42, 43,000. But the thing is, if he uses the exact techniques on the other sites, Geisenkler is always older than the other proto-ordination sites and the so-called early ordination sites. So no matter how you date it, whether with TL, ESR, these are always at the very beginning of the ordination. And a lot of our French colleagues, even now, give me a hard time. I don't do the dating. I can't, but maybe, Christoph, you can come and date some more. And then, but my niece did a PhD already on the topic. In any case, interesting that these, if anything, seem to be very, very early. And it seems that the art begins with the beginnings of the ordination. Last site is Hohlefels. I'll try to be quick. This is a site we're currently digging today, Sunday, but tomorrow the dig will continue. We have a rich middle Paleolithic, and again here, it's a little tricky because this everything's tilted, and that I was also really happy to see the excavation today digging on a slope. Some teams actually dig flat through these sites. What planet are these people living on if you're digging those horizontal spits through these layers? And I see sites, people, I say, what are you doing? You have to follow the geology. And they say, no, that's too much work, right? and you guys do it normally. We do it normally, and most teams don't, because it's too much work and you have to know what you're doing. But one of countless examples of how the work you do sets standards for everyone and elevates the work in the field. It's some of the most basic things are ignored. In any case, red is ordination, lots of ordination. Blue is Middle Paleolithic, and green and yellow are Gravettian and Magdalenian, which I could say a lot about, but I won't. This is what the site looks like now, and I don't know if you can tell, but this is a super rich deposit we're digging right now, 14A, kilos and kilos of burnt bone, thousands of artifacts, and all these things, but never, ever figurative art, never, ever beads, never any of these things. They're never there, no matter how rich the deposit is. You can draw your own conclusions. If you want to say Neanderthals are making lots of flutes and artworks and things, and we're just not finding them, I find that a little hard to believe. That we find things like leaf points, that's super interesting. Here's Verla Rutz working on them. And this is sort of interesting because we remember the Rana site I mentioned? They're associated with leaf points. There are a lot of debates about late Middle Paleolithic material culture. If anyone wants, we can talk about that over a beer, but let's just say we have interesting things. And then what happens is these are the fine densities just at the Middle Paleolithic, and you can see the lower layers have more material, and as we go up, it does seem like the occupation intensity among Neanderthals declines. I don't have any strong opinion on this. This is an observation, but as I think a lot of people know, people argue that there could be population collapses, bottlenecks, maybe health issues. I would say our results show, and that's consistent with this idea of the population vacuum when modern humans come in. These are the three richest Middle Paleolithic layers in comparison with the rich Organation layers. There's really, I always say, about a factor of 10 material at least between the Organation and the Middle Paleolithic. There is some evidence for more diversified subsistence with more emphasis on fish, birds, small game, hair. There's tons of worked ivory. Sometimes I call this the l'âge d'ivoire, I think, for the ivory exhibit in Paris, right? The age of ivory, because everything is made from ivory. And what's funny is there are a lot of places where there are mammoths and ivory, but it's not used so much. Where in our area, everything's made from ivory. Here, a perforated baton. There's a very similar one at Geisenkliffs. We think we're trying to figure out what this is. You know, traditionally they're interpreted as some sort of power, symbol of power. We think, and they're very carefully made. They're not easy to make. And with of course, the stratigraphic position, the dating's clear. And we think, I'm not saying that everyone has to be used for rope making, but you can definitely use it for rope making, and you can make, let's say, 5 meters of rope in 10 minutes with 4 people. And if you got good at it, you could almost certainly do it faster. But I think any of you who study twine and rope know you don't need a tool to make rope or twine. You can just do it with your hands and your thigh. So I'm not saying this has to be the solution, but it's consistent. The hypothesis that this could be a rope-making tool has not been refuted, and there's some evidence supporting it. Ornaments, I have to be quick. I can't go into ornaments, but there are so many different kinds of ornaments, and we have about 1,000 different examples. These are the most typical ones, the double perforated beads, but they're triple perforated. You can see lots of different shapes. And then this is interesting. These are my friends, but Francesco gives me a hard time about everything. And he published with Marianne van Haren and this was based on a sample that was less than 10% of what we have now. This is what was published in 2023. And the two of them argued that the Swabian sites form the basal root of an analysis of the material with the highest diversity, and they argued that this is the source of the Organation based on the ornaments, keeping in mind that this is 10% of the sample we now have, right? So when you're I don't want to say enemies, even rivals, but let's just say when your colleagues who are sometimes critical of your work take even more extreme positions than we do, arguing that this is the beginning and the basal group of Organation identity and language, that's kind of interesting. Then we found all sorts of things. The Kraft-Negression hypothesis, we found a water bird, and the two people who were happiest about this were David Lewis Williams and Jean-Claude. I published this in 2003 in Nature, because we also found another lion man, just a little. This is the only one I found myself. I have a particular affinity to this one. It's very small, but I looked at it. It was a really sunny day like today. I looked at, that's a lion man. What's going on here? And it was funny. So I apologize. I'm not telling another anecdote, but I will try to refrain. So that winter, there was a meeting in Liège about spiritualité that Marcel Ott was hosting, and Jean-Claude was there. And it was all about the spiritual side of hominids and early modern humans. And it was Christmas time, and I was at the Liège Christmas market and drinking mulled wine with Jean-Claude. And the question was always, well, the shamanism supporters just say, well, everything is shamanism, right? You always have shaman everywhere to travel to the netherworld to solve the problems we have, death, life, rainfall, hunting, whatever. And that everything else is a spirit and is some sort of helper spirit for the shaman. And so I remember very clearly saying to Jean over mulled wine, well, Jean, is there anything I could find that would refute the shamanism hypothesis? And he took a sip of mulled wine and said, no. And so that's the problem with the shamanism hypothesis. And he and Lewis Williams always say, well, it's not about being refutable, it's about being plausible. And I agree, it's highly plausible. But I think from a kind of theoretical point of view, a hypothesis that cannot be refuted no matter what you do is at least a little problematic. So in any case, so 3 lion men from 3 different sites. It's like, I always say, it's like, if you find one Jesus on a cross, you say, well, that's weird. Jesus, a man on a cross, that's weird. Probably don't worry too much about it. But if you find a second one or a third one, then you say, okay, this is a religion or something. Okay, then Holefez, a while back, we found a female figurine. I can't go into the details due to time constraints. I'm probably already talking too long, but that was a pretty big deal because, and it was funny. We had the first piece came up when I was giving the keynote lecture in 2008 in Frankfurt, and I was taking so much flack from the Africans. I work a lot in Africa. I was sitting next to Tony Marks, and Alison Brooks said, that's why I hate recordings. I can't tell my good stories. But and Tony said to me, because I was arguing that well, the oldest, it's just an observation, the oldest musical instruments, figurative art, mythical imagery, arbitrary three-dimensional formed ornaments are not found in Africa. Not even if we come from Africa, not everything has to come from Africa. Some does, some. And in any case, I was sort of called a Nazi for believing that. I'm not even a Nazi. I'm not a Nazi at all. But the interesting thing is, that was the day this was found. And it was, so in addition to all these other things, we've got female figurines, which are typically associated with the Gredian. This, I think, has a strong biological connection. It's not a pregnant woman. It's a woman right after birth. The pubic triangle and the vulva are very open. The full breast, I could say a lot about this, but I think this is something very closely related to obviously the female reproductive sphere. And this was in your museum today, right? You don't want your women of reproductive age dying, right? You need to make sure the kid's well and the mom's well. And that's what I think this is about. It's something I think from the female area, much more like a midwife than some sort of Paul Mellers at the time literally talked about paleographic pornography. That was the headline in Nature. In any case, all these things are always found right in the middle of the main cultural debris. There's a second female figurine. Also, the interesting thing is, this is super interesting. Can you see the hands? The hands are here. Pubic triangle, vulva, full breast, no head, no feet. I can say a lot about this. But the hands, I always think, I've been there when babies were born, but I never was pregnant. But it's like, for me, like after you have a really good meal, like this, and I don't know, maybe the mothers in the room, that's just my, and the other thing was, the last part of it that came, the last piece was this piece. There are 9 pieces, and it was the breast and another perfect hand. And so the hands are very distinctive. No feet. Why are there no feet? Because it's not about locomotion, it's about reproduction. And some mothers in the room, try taking care of a baby with no hands or no arms, right? No mother milk, it's going to be a problem. And the second one, it's another breast, and it's got the fingertips again right under the breast, which is pretty cool, right? You never find just one if you keep looking. But we haven't found the rest of us. It must be there somewhere. This came out last year, a bear, a flute a while back, and again, the flute. This is by far the most complete one. Griffin vultures, do you see the finger holes? Just what I said. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And just like the art is perfect, the music is perfect. You can play any song you want on this. There is nothing primitive about these musical instruments. And they're often found at the base of the sequence. It's not at the end of the organization. The flutes especially are at the bottom of the sequence. These are some of the examples. I've got to go quick. And again, these are what I would say is the oldest depictions at Chauvet they overlap with our younger ones. It seems like our older ones are a bit older. And then also, not too much later, you start to see a diversity of depictions, right? These are the kinds of ones Laurent Garand was talking about. Of course, the fabulous Chauvet's, the most amazing Fumane, Kolibora, Stratzing near Vienna, and then all of our figurines. I didn't show them all because of time constraints, but art, presumably music, religion, all of these things, ornaments, become part of normal life, and they were never part of normal life before. These are the people who made it. Then, let's be fair, is this a unique situation? I've always argued there must be similar things happening elsewhere. Things were pretty lonely until recently. And then Maxime Aubert and his team from Australia started publishing results from Borneo, here going back to about 40,000 years ago. More recently from Sulawesi, and the original dates for Sulawesi went back to about 44,000, and just this week in Nature there was another publication going back to 51,000. Okay, now these are the things that get a bit sensitive. I'm super happy if these are old, if they can be 100,000 years old, does it? But still, you have to embrace the process. I haven't seen any profiles, any assemblages, any of these things. We know dating crust is not so straightforward, so it'll be very helpful if the teams start digging sites, get assemblages together, and then we can be sure. I hope that all this can be confirmed, and wish them luck. And that brings us to the conclusions. Modern humans arrived along the Danube. We can see some evidence for their expanded diet breadth. A lot of new technologies developed. I couldn't go into many of them, but lithic technologies, the perforated batons, and many other things. Population density, absolute populations rise greatly. New forms of communication become necessary to maintain social and economic relations. Also here, I have to be brief, but it seems like Neanderthals, I don't know, I don't know what the birth rate's like nowadays in Spain, but if you grow up in a big family, or you have your aunts and uncles and people you spend your whole life with, you can communicate pretty easily by contact, or facial expressions, physical contact, touching each other. There are many ways you can communicate, and we know at the time of Schöningen there has to be communication about the past, present, future. So it's not as if these people couldn't communicate. They also probably had verbal languages, maybe not as sophisticated as our own, maybe they were, who knows. But certainly at this time we start to see art, music, ornaments, talking about identity of people, and it happens over and over again because their social relations are more complicated, or at least it fits in with that. Figurative art, music, and other innovations accompanied the demographic and further geographic expansion of Homo sapiens. The Swabian caves provide an exceptional record of this process. There's nowhere in the world where we have this kind of detailed information. Art, music, and religion became universal human phenomena as modern humans spread across the planet, likely with a polycentric pattern of innovation. Presumably, these kinds of things are happening in different places around the world. If you want to come see the finds, you have to go to these museums. And of course, many, many colleagues have helped over the years. I can't name them all. And I don't think, Noemi, are you on the, yes, you're on the list. So I think you're the only one on the list. So well done, Noemi. And really, I tried not to forget it, but I don't. Okay, and then of course the work's funded by lots of people, just like here. If you don't have good funding, it's a little hard to get the work done. And I think that's all, and I'll just stop there. Thank you very much.
So thank you for such a lovely, wonderful, exciting, beautiful talk. I think it's really enlightening, and well, there is the opportunity. You want to ask some questions?
Yeah.
Just a wonderful presentation, Professor Nick. Just a curiosity about the origins and expansion of art as a culture process. How do you see like the many art occurrences are part of the transmission or dispersal? But then we also see, like, for example, let's say mitochondrial DNA record or genetics shows the source populations going across, but art doesn't really travel much.
Yeah.
And then we see examples like Liang Bulu and so.
Yeah.
Do you think within the modern populations, modern human populations of early Homo sapiens, we do also have examples of convergence, regional occurrences, and they are quite different?
Yeah, what I think that was my point, that I assume, so when the results from especially Borneo and Sulawesi came out, I'm really happy about that, because I don't think what happens in Swabia is completely unique, only one time in the whole world. And when you look at the neighboring sites in Europe, there are also big differences, right? Fumane has completely different kinds of depictions. Monochrome, very schematic red depictions, it's completely different. Even Chauvet, unbelievably beautiful work, but parietal art, right? And we have a couple pieces of collapsed wall with some pigment on it. But some people in the room will know the pigment really stays on the rocks, on the painted rocks well. If we had complete painted walls and they collapsed, we'd find them, right? And we don't. And also at Chauvet, there are mammoths around, right? Think of all the mammoths that are painted in Chauvet, but they don't have mammoth sculpture. So and think of what Laurent Grand and others were talking about in the Dordogne. There are a lot of different regional trends, not only in art, but in a million different things, right? Things evolve in different ways in different places, undergo selection, transmission. And so I would say the pattern is not surprising at all. And I assume that if the Southeast Asia art is confirmed with stratified deposits, assemblages that are demonstrated, I assume it's an independent development.
Perishables, like you have some good preservation of wood in other sites, right? So you don't have anything that would be like perishable material, because when you think about, you don't really have to have a flute to have music.
Of course not.
Because you can have hands.
Yeah.
And all sorts of things.
I mean, that's the beauty of Schöningen, right? At Schöningen, it's I don't want to say the only site. There are other sites with organic material, but Schöningen has so much organic material. It gives you a clear indication of how much we're missing. And that's why I quoted that. The easiest way to be wrong about our ancestors is to underestimate them. So let's look at music. Why do we have flutes? Because they're made in bone and ivory. Of course they would have skin drums and all sorts of other things, right? And so I personally don't think it's an exaggeration at all to assume that the people who have all these different flutes that are much more complicated to make had drums, just as an example, or a reed, and you can play the flutes with a reed, and then they sound. There's one French guy who does it. It's a bit harsh to the ear, but there is a guy who thinks that's the main way. I can't remember his name. And, but you could, and there's another guy who does play. It sounds a little like a squeaky oboe, right? And there are lots of things we're missing, for sure. And that's why I kind of like the work at Fumana, right? With the feathers and all these different things. We're only seeing this much of the whole picture.
Okay, I have one or two, but one of them can be over the beer. So
sure.
So I'm going to make a very basic question that I'm sure a lot of people made you before, but I think it's interesting to bring. Is like most of the amazing, beautiful things you show us are around 44,000 years and everything. So someone may claim that Neanderthals did not have that because they were extinct at that time. So it was really about time that if Neanderthals didn't die out, they would have made something like that. Or not, or maybe they extinct because they couldn't make something like this, or what do you think?
Well, I'd say the art, we can be sure by 40,000, right? I think if Neanderthals were left on their own, they probably wouldn't have developed art. I don't think so, because they had plenty of time to do it, right? And I think there was a specific social, economic, historical condition that led to, right, that one of the main points I'm making is modern humans were around for a very long time and didn't make figurative art or music, as far as we know. And I studied Neanderthals. Neanderthals, there's nothing wrong with Neanderthals, but that's not how they lived, right? And I published about this, that their way of communicating, right? So, and Clive Gamble and other people have talked about this, is that if you are just there if you have a big family, your brothers, your sisters, your aunts and uncles, you spend your whole life with these people in a relatively small group, you don't need all kinds of symboling, right? Because the things you need to do don't require it. And I would argue that there are probably times when Neanderthal population densities are fairly high, right? There are parts of France where you have lots and lots of sites. But they could go about their business without this. Come on, there's so many Neanderthal sites, Mysterian sites that have been dug across Europe. If they had these things, we would know for sure. So I would say they didn't need it. And it's not a value judgment in any way. It doesn't mean that Neanderthals were primitive in any way, but it seems that some combination of either biological stress, bottlenecks, it does seem that in some areas, the effective population, the geneticists have other ways of modeling now other than that, but show small populations. We know the populations of modern humans are also small. We know the Inuits live in small populations. All mobile hunter-gatherers do, right? It's only the less mobile hunter-gatherers with storage practices that have higher population densities. But it does seem like there are a lot more people on the ground. And another thing that kind of goes with this is, we're talking about bears at Sima and other sites, right? We have so many bears, just like millions of bear bones. What happens, the bears and the Neanderthals, no problem. They go, they avoid each other. Sometimes Neanderthals hunted them. Sometimes Homo erectus or Homo heidelbergensis hunted them. At Schöningen, we can prove that. But it didn't stress out the populations. And then when we get into the Upper Paleolithic, some people would say, it's mostly the beginnings of the last glacial maximum, but I don't think that's the case. I think that we have at Hohlefels, we have a projectile in the spine of a bear. They're definitely being hunted, and they get pinched out. And I think it's not about being smart, dumb, or creative, but demographically you become isolated, the populations get small and become unsustainable, and you die out with some interbreeding.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry. Thanks. Some kind of rituals they may have been because of for example, the cave of Bruniquel in France with this inside area. So this it seems to be really some ritual or whatever there.
Yeah, I agree with you. I was trying to highlight that. I couldn't give all the examples, but there is some evidence of symbolism and with the kinds of things that Juan Luis has been talking about with Excalibur for many years, the burial of the dead, all these things. I'm in no way trying to say anything critical of archaics. All I'm saying is there's no grotte Chauvet with Neanderthals, right? Put it this way, if we find a grotte Chauvet with Neanderthals, I'll be the happiest person, but we haven't yet.
Yeah, they don't need it. Yes, I'm agree with that. Thanks.
So, if there are no more questions, first we want to thank you so much again for coming here, for accepting the invitation. Gift of memory for you of your visit here.
Very nice. And I was just admiring this in the museum. It was really, I was looking at it, very beautiful, very good lighting. Beautiful. It really, I haven't seen it in a while. It's really beautiful and spectacular. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And my final word would be, I came because of my love and admiration for the team, but every time I come, I learn so much, and I mean this when I say you're the best team in the world. I mean that, and that's, I wanted to say with the funding agencies here. Yeah. So tell them tomorrow that I said, I'm not going to be advisory board. I'm 100% serious when I said that. Yeah. You know, to be honest, I don't even think it's close. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.